preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rabbi Paul Joseph, Associate Director of Humanities for Jewish Education here at the 92nd Street Y. And welcome to part 2 of a 4-part series entitled Accounting for Jewish Survival. This is really a continuation, in a way, of a great intellectual adventure that many of you, I know, may have shared in since the beginning of the year, in which we ran a series at that time called Nearsighted Visions of Redemption, in which we examined Freudianism and Marxism and Herzlian Zionism and so forth, the different flawed messianisms, the secular substitutes for the classical Jewish notions on these subjects. And through the year, we've undertaken a serious exploration of Jewish life and thought and culture, ethnological, political, racial, psychological, and religious. And all of which, in a certain way, has been a response to Martin Buber's challenging assertion that the existence of the Jewish people, the existence of Israel, is something unique and unclassifiable. It escapes all of the conventional categories of nature and society. And yet, despite this caveat, thinkers of all schools have not been dissuaded from trying. And last time we had the opportunity to hear Professor Ellis Rifkin, and tonight we will have the opportunity to hear Professor David Sidorsky, Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. Professor Sidorsky's own education comes from his PhD at Columbia, as well as his Hebrew literature degree from Jewish Theological Seminary and his studies at Hebrew University. In addition to his teaching at Columbia, he serves as the vice president of the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy. He's a specialist in political and ethical philosophy and theory, has taught in addition to Columbia at Hebrew Union College and the Jewish Theological Seminary in Jewish history and Hebrew literature. He's a former editor of Reconstructionist magazine. He serves on the Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs and is a scholar in residence to the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, and most recently was honored to be elected president of Histadrut Havrית. And with all of this, he brings us a world-encompassing view as he looks at Marxist and other universalist theories of Jewish survival and offers some thoughtful probing criticisms and some speculations for the future. Won't you welcome Professor David Sidorsky?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be at the 92nd Street Y, to be participating in this program. And I have prepared for it a fairly difficult outline of topics to be covered, 6, and therefore I think, since I have this rocky road to go, before I think I get to some lively and unconventional contemporaneous material, I hope you'll bear with me through the process. Indeed, I'm going to begin in that very academic fashion, which is that I begin to speak and you to listen, and if you finish before I do, you must raise your hand. And the point of that is to make sure, despite the lights, that no one's raising their hand already, that everyone can hear me, that my voice is carrying okay in the mic. And the second point of that academic sort of non-humor understatement is to tell you I'm going to be very pedagogically correct in the narrowest sense of the word. That is to say, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to tell you what I do as I'm doing it, and then after I finish, I'll tell you what I've done. So what I intend to do is 6 points: an introduction, a conclusion, and 4 in between. The introductory point is, of course, to say that the question is wrong, that there's no such thing as a philosophy of Jewish history that can explain survival. There's no such thing for English history, for American history, for German history, for Jewish history. There is no, it's the attempt to believe that there's a science of history that can give causal analysis is fraudulent. Then, having therefore made that point, I'll go on to give what is the philosophy of Jewish history. That is to say, what is the major perspective in which Jews have internalized the study of their history, and that is the interpretation of what I guess one would call normative Judaism, from when Judaism as a religion first emerged to the period of the French Revolution, to the Enlightenment. And that's the second point, is what is the philosophy of history, what is the perspective on history of Judaism. Then the third point is the breakdown of that perspective. The breakdown of that perspective during the Enlightenment. The breakdown of that perspective which gives the rise to the problems of modernity and to the speculations which Rabbi Joseph mentioned of alternative messianic visions and so on. And I wish to discuss the nature of that breakdown and the kinds of trauma of ghettoization, trauma of overcoming the previous history of ghettoization that led to. And that's the third point, the various models of Jewish normalcy. The fourth point finally brings us to where the plot thickens, and we have Marxism, and we have other types of particular Jewish messianism, the particular rejections of normalcy or treatments of the trauma of ghettoization that have characterized the ideological conflict of modern Jewish life. The fifth point is to discuss the breakdown in turn of those, some with the rise of Nazism, some with 1989 with the debacle of Marxism, some earlier, some still to be worked out, socialist Zionism, American liberalism. And the sixth is, frankly, to say where I stand and where we go from here. So that's what I intend to do, and let me then go back and begin at the beginning. I said that a philosophy of history, the way in which the 19th century tried to argue there's a philosophy of history, or the way in which the question is assumed, we can answer the question of Jewish survival, answer why Jews survived, is a non-starter, because no historian and no interpretation of history can give causal analysis, in my view. They cannot say this happened because of this, or give prediction. The model of history is a science on the model of natural science, of a physics or chemistry or biology, is just not correct. And since it's not correct, there is no such causal analysis. Historians, of course, can trace down what happened when. They can discuss some of the causes that seem to be conditioning factors. They can discuss some of the reasons or motives of the historical agents. And they therefore can give some account or reconstruction of what happened in a kind of sequence. But to say that it ought to have happened, or it would have happened, or it must have happened, or it could not have happened differently, or this led to that, is beyond what historians can do. Any attempt to believe that we can predict the next stage of history is simply fraudulent or illusory. And that is at the heart, of course, of any attempt to make a secular religion of history or a god of history, that it just will not work. The skeptical wisdom of Ecclesiastes at the beginning, that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor wisdom to the man of understanding, but time and chance come to all men. 8, the season, but it's not a sort of predictable season. Some winters have thaws, some springs have sudden storms. 8, season, vafega, accident, touch. Somebody touches you when you're dead, and so on. Time and chance come to all men. That is true of history. And the obvious evidence is, of course, Jewish history, rather remarkable, the unpredictability of Jewish history in case after case. A month ago, I was on the plane from Budapest to Lida with Soviet Jews who'd taken trains from Moscow to Budapest. This was not predictable a year ago, not predictable 10 years ago. Indeed, many cases would have been written off as beyond the inevitabilities of history. In that sense, the notion of a science of history comes out of a peculiar ethos of Western thought and was a combination of science and religion, and is an illusion which is worth exploring. It is true that we have great books that are speculative on aspects of Jewish survival. And they have very often great, what I guess the technical term would be aperçu, appropriate term would be, great little insights into what happened here and there. There's a book by Yechezkel Kaufman on Gola v'Nechar, on exile, and the whole point is something about how the Jews were always culturally assimilationist and yet always religiously non-conversionist. And this formula he sees as a key to Jewish survival. And it has some interesting points and interesting arguments. And that's one reason why I argued that Jewish territory was now mandatory in the 19th century. It's the operative conclusion, the use of the history for that purpose that's critical. And of course, Dubnov and Baron, two great historians of the diaspora, have pointed out again and again, very dramatically, how the ability of small Jewish communities to have a combination of ethnos, peoplehood, ethnic identity, and religion, interlocking religious commitment with their ethnicity, expressed in a community, expressed in a congregation, whether in Baghdad or in China, in Australia or in South Africa or in New York, meant a capacity to survive creatively in adverse circumstances. That's a very interesting point, and of course fueled, especially in Dubnov's case, the belief that you could have in the future a kind of diaspora nationalism, diaspora cultural nationalism. But again, the formula does not explain survival, doesn't explain why this community lives and this one dies, does not explain, of course, why Dubnov himself died in Lithuania in 1939, and why the Jewish community of his Vilna, that is of his Jerusalem of Lithuania, also died. It simply explains some aspects of Jewish survival without being able to give a predictive or an overall interpretation. And the same is true for any other interpretation that you would give, not because Jews are unique or special, but because this would be true for French history and German history and so on. The inability of historians to develop a predictive model that can explain why Rome falls or Athens falls or Troy falls or does not fall. As the witches in Macbeth says, Banquo says skeptically of the witches of Macbeth, if you can tell which seed will grow and which will not. That requires witchcraft or astrology. And of course, the Talmud says of astrology, en mazal b'Yisrael, which people always translate as no luck in Israel, but it means no astrology should be practiced in Israel. And that means we cannot have this kind of prediction. There is no kind of historical prediction that will account, in any case, for this kind of phenomenon. Eit vafega kara l'chol ha'adam, time and chance happen to all men, including Jews, who are also part of mankind. Now, that having been said, the recognition that you cannot have that kind of historical explanation, historical account, we do come to the point that perspectives on Jewish history, it's myself illustrated, a perspective which says Judaism was a creative response of a religion and ethnos to conditions of adversity. I should mention perhaps one other such vision. Professor Talmon, the great contemporary Israeli historian, showing how the very change of anti-Semitism through the generations, from an ethnic anti-Semitism in Alexandria to religious anti-Semitism in Christianity and Islam, to a secular, racial, or national anti-Semitism in the modern period, stimulated Jewish response in adversity and created, therefore, responses which fueled Jewish survival. And that seems to me to be true. And each of these theories, though they do not have the kind of causal power that has been ascribed to theories of history, does suggest a direction. The Dubnov Baron about creating community, the Talmud about responding to adversity, the Kaufman one about guaranteeing some sort of combination of cultural openness and religious or national uniqueness. In every case, there is a formula there for continuity of Jewish life. And that, I take it, is the strength of the philosophies of history. They provide formula or options for guidance for the future. And that brings me to the second point. What was the perspective of traditional Jewish history and the option it provided? Here we have a rather remarkable story, because Judaism is concerned with being an historical religion. Baron's great cultural social history of the Jews begins with that paragraph, or that chapter, in which he says some religions are religion of nature. They take their place from nature. And to some extent, Jews did have a conception of sacred space. Jerusalem was a sacred space, sacred land. Hebrew was a sacred tongue. But of course, the central conception was sacred time. The Jews lived in time. Sabbath was sacred time, the story of creation, and the story of their temporal role. And therefore, in that sense, a perspective on history is where Judaism begins. And especially, I do not mean when the Bible was written, biblical Judaism, but especially when the Bible became edited, when Judaism as a religion became fixed, somewhere in the early Mishnaic period, say, or somewhere even before it, somewhere between the 2nd century BC and the 5th century AD, when the notion of Judaism as a religion became fixed with the Talmud and with the editing of the Bible and the fixing of the texts, you get a certain perspective on Jewish history. That perspective is explained almost traditionally in where the Bible begins. The Bible begins with Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And that beginning is, of course, the first parasha, the first reading for the week of the Torah. And that is the first reading of the year, first weekly reading of the year for the Torah. And that tells you how there is an effort by God to create the world in time. Creating the world in time, he wants it to survive in time. In order to survive it in time, he creates mankind, and he makes, in effect, a covenant with man, in which if man keeps his commandments, the world will survive in time. The first covenant is with Adam. The first covenant is with Adam. It is therefore a covenant with man as a universal man in idyllic Eden, under ideal circumstances. No exploitation of man by man. There's a garden. What could be lovelier than a garden? Watered by 4 rivers. Every man has his mate. There's vegetarianism, Adam, Eve, vegetarianism, wonderful society. And in this culture of command, Adam will guarantee the survival of the species. Except, of course, that the covenant fails. Adam and Eve fail the covenant, and universal man under ideal circumstances fails. Strike one, or first batter out, as you say. Second batter to the plate, second parasha in the Bible, is Noah. Universal mankind. To this day in Jewish law, the laws of Noah, the Noahide Code, are the laws that apply to all mankind. So it's the period of Noah. Noah and his three sons, period of mankind. Mankind as they are, everyday man. Mankind east of Eden, corrupt man, corruptible man. But he merits survival. Well, he doesn't. His life is not a blessing. The world is full of this word Hamas, violence, depredation. Malay haaretz Hamas. The world is full of this ugliness, evil. And what can happen, therefore, is the flood, which will destroy all mankind. God does not destroy all mankind. The rainbow, the bow of God against the earth is stilled, and the rainbow replaces it. But nonetheless, it's a sort of grudging. Mankind is evil. There is no blessing in mankind. The world can go on without a blessing. Mankind's life in temporal history is blemished. In that sense, universal mankind under normal circumstances, as opposed to the ideal circumstance of Eden, fails. Second strike, or if you will, second batter at the bat. And then comes the remarkable climax, the third parasha, the parasha Lech Lecha, the third section of the Torah. The one is Adam, and creation in Adam, Eden. 2 is Noah. 3rd, Abraham at the bat. And of course, this is almost paradoxical. 100-year-old man, 90-year-old wife. Mankind will be saved to you. History will survive through you. She laughs. Realistic people laugh. And therefore they name the son who is born Yitzchak. He will laugh because it's a joke. And it is a joke if you think of it. It is to say, you fail with Adam and universal mankind. You fail with Noah and all mankind. And now you try with a small group, with an old man, an old woman, and a child to be born to them in old age will be a joke. And if you even want the paradox of the humor, of course, it's that you have to obey God, just as Adam and Eve had to, just as the people of Noah's time had to, even when he commands you to sacrifice your son. So here you've gotten the one son, joke, and lo and behold, you have to sacrifice him. How will your children be multiple as the sand in the sea and the stars in the sky if you kill him? And yet you obey the command. And by that loyalty, lo and behold, the promise is fulfilled, the covenant is kept. Irony of ironies, third man at the bat, or third strike, he stays in the box. He obeys the laws. Now I said Judaism, not Abraham's time. Jewish interpretation of obeying the laws means obeying the traditional commandments, the 613 commandments. The 365 thou shalt nots for the number of days in the year, and the 248 thou shalts for the number of veins in the body, but you obey the 613 commandments. And as long as you do that, history survives. Jewish history survives, mankind survives. The covenant to Abraham says, Ki b'cha yitbarchu kol mishpachot ha'adama. For through you shall be blessed all the peoples of the earth. So as long as you obey the commandments, you are the agency of the blessing. The chosen people, chosen because it failed with Adam and Noah, the agency of the blessing. The ironic chosen people who would think that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can pull it off after the others have failed, but lo and behold, it works. Perhaps not happily, perhaps not too successfully. The 613 commandments are mundane, but it works. The survival continues. Indeed, so successfully does it continue that when the Christian message is, it's worked, it's been pulled off, God has now redeemed the world, they don't step out of the box. You continue in the box, you're still at bat. You're at bat throughout historical time because you are the agency. Through you shall the people, families of the earth be blessed. Now, the point I wish to stress, including this second point, is simply that in doing this, the Jewish community found for its future, for its morale and its sense of the future, a wonderful balance between the universal and the particular. It's perhaps too cute a balance, too perfect a balance, in the sense that obey the particular and you'll fulfill the universal. You don't have to look for causes, you don't have to look for special charities or what have you. If you obey the particular commandments, then you have fulfilled the universal. You have redeemed time. You have redeemed mankind in time. It is a remarkable formula. If you are tenaciously loyal to your particularist code, you have also fulfilled your universal obligations. And that really is the essential, what you would say, essential crux, if I may use that term, the essential point of morale, that the particular and the universal are seized. Frost has this poem about a person who wants to be a poet and wants also to fulfill his avocation, his poetry, his vocation, something. He writes, "Yield who will to their separation, my object in living is to unite my vocation, my avocation, as my two eyes make one in sight." And the point here is there's no separation between particularism and universalism. They are combined as my two eyes make one in sight. That's the story, with all the suffering and so on, from the fixing of Judaism, whenever it was fixed, say 3rd century BC, say 1st century AD, whenever it was fixed, through the 18th century. The 18th century is the collapse of that vision, the collapse of the belief that Jews are a chosen people whose universal and whose particular are so united. And the trauma of that collapse, the trauma of that search now for a balance between universalism and particularism, has been the tragedy and the abnormalcy of modern Jewish history from an internal point of view. And it's not, of course, a tragedy in the sense in which the destruction of European Jewry is a tragedy, but a tragedy in the sense of the internal perspective and internal morale, the loss of weight, the loss of gravitas, the loss of one's sense of fulfillment and role in history. Of course, you would say, given the 18th century, given in the Enlightenment, it was inevitable. How can you use the old joke, how can you keep people on the farm after they've seen Paris? How can you keep Jews believing in the chosenness of observing the 613 commandments and keeping kosher and doing this and the other thing after they have seen the world of the Enlightenment, after they've seen modern science and modern art and modern music? For the Jews of the 18th century, the world of the Enlightenment was dazzling, and it meant that the ghetto was wrong. Moses, son of Mendel of Dessau, could believe in that world. Moses, son of Mendel, going from peddler who spoke in Yiddish to a person who translated the Bible into German and then to the prize of the Prussian Academy, and therefore becoming no longer Moses, son of Mendel, but Moses Mendelssohn, believed in the outside values of the outside world. The family was musical. They had a lot of klezmerim, itzigs, so on, were all klezmerim, that is, they entertained at Jewish weddings and so on. The musical genes go on to, of course, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy and to Offenbach, another relative. The point is, I think, I'm sorry, to Meyerbeer is the relative of the Mendelssohns, to Felix Mendelssohn to Meyerbeer. The point is that the transformation from internal Jewish culture to the Enlightenment world, in some sense, meant the universal and the particular are not won through obeying the Jewish commandments. There's a universal world, and it's more attractive, or it has more power. Science, or music, or art, or the struggle for social justice. Now, the immediate form that this transition takes in the 18th century, with the breakdown of the ghetto, is a search for Jewish normalcy. And this, then, is my third point, the breakdown of the conventional perspective, its replacement by the search for Jewish normalcy. We no longer wish to be the chosen people who integrate in our particularism our universalism. We want to be a normal entity. If a religion, then a normal religion, a religion like all the religions. In Moses Mendelssohn, or the Jewish communities Berlin of the 18th century and early 19th century, that meant a Protestant religion. So Judaism would be a kind of Jewish Protestantism. It would have an organ, would have the cathedral synagogue, would have a rabbi dressed in robes like a Protestant minister, and be a normal religion, that is to say, a congregation of voluntary people who went to temple on Saturday and said their prayers in German and in Hebrew, more in German than in Hebrew, had decorum, and so on. A normal religion like all religions, with an ethics and with a social justice program, but basically a religious community. If in France, then it's some sort of Catholic community. The Catholic French Jewish community is sort of Gemeinde, but really a liberal Catholic community, combination between Huguenot and liberal community, which is what the French community is supposed to be in Napoleonic France. And if in Italy or in Austria-Hungary, a religion like all the religions. Moses Mendelssohn even gave the formula for it. Its core would be ethical monotheism, like Protestantism, like Catholicism, like Judaism. And its form, outside form, would be the traditional dress in a normalized religion. This is a goal. In some sense, is the American goal. A congregation in some place in New England, Connecticut will be a church that looks like a New England church and will have a lovely Jewish congregation. A Midwestern Jewish congregation will be the same. A normal religion like all religions. If you feel, as the Eastern European ethnic community felt strongly, this is a sellout. Haram said this is avdut b'toch herut, this is slavery in the guise of emancipation. If you feel that this is a sellout, then the Zionist answer was normalcy, of course. We can no longer be the chosen people, but a nation like all the nations, not a religion like all the religions. And a nation like all the nations means a normal nation. In normal nations, your particularism is you express the universal through your particular values. You express the universal goal of brotherhood, let's say, through your patriotism. You express the universal goal of your cultural aspiration through your particular national culture. Shakespeare, after all, represents the universal values of particularist English culture. Bialik will represent the universalist values of particular Hebraic culture. A nation like all the nations, a normal nation, means normal farmers, normal soldiers, and that, of course, was the Zionist ideal, the breakdown of the ghetto and normalization of Jewish life. And the same was even true for the ethnic community which was not Zionist, which was diaspora nationalist, will be ethnic Jews speaking Yiddish in Eastern Europe, in Lithuania or in Ukraine or in White Russia. This will be the mass Judaism of Volksjudentum, of the ordinary Jewish person. And very cultivated people like Peretz or Sholem Aleichem. Their heroes are the ordinary Jew, the ordinary Jewish shoemaker, the ordinary Jewish carpenter. This is the normalization of Jewish life, either as a non-territorial ethnic community with minority rights, or even later as a territorial ethnic community in Eastern Europe, in Crimea or in Azerbaijan. But the point is the search for normalcy because of the breakdown of the relationship between universal and particular. There will be a new relationship which will be a normal relationship. Jews express the universal values they share with all mankind through their particularist ethos. In Yiddish, if you're a Yiddish ethnic nationalist. In Hebrew, if you're a Zionist. In a normal religious framework, if you're a emancipationist of Mendelssohn's kind. The search for the breakdown of the ghettos to be replaced by the normalization of Jewish life. And the great conflicts, the great ideological conflict, was between those who believed first that Judaism should be a religion like all religions. There's an ethical monotheism with its traditional dress, whether it's Moses Mendelssohn or classic Reform Judaism, Herman Cohen and so on. The Zionists, who believed that was a sellout, it should be a nation like all the nations. Or the Yiddish ethnic nationalists, who believed it should be a diaspora nation of normal Yiddish-speaking Jews, not some sort of dream of going to Israel and reconstructing Hebrew and all the rest of it. So that's I take it that was my, I've forgotten now, my second or my third. Third. So I come to the fourth, which is the special time where the plot thickens, if you're with me on this. This is what sort of should have been if Jews were normal people. When I was in Israel a month ago, I mentioned the trip from Budapest with the Russian Jews to Israel. I got there and they said, how do you find the situation? So on. I said, well, the morale is great because of the Soviet Jewish emigration. It's very unique, but it's much better than before. That is, the morale is better than before. I don't understand why you don't play golf. Of course, you can imagine the shock here, but I was really saying normalcy. Normalcy is playing golf. And they said, well, you should get, that was the day of the political crisis, the day the government fell. I said, well, you should get Peres and Rabin and Sharon and Aarons out to play a foursome and announce whether they're patching together a government or not. Do it at the 18th hole. Of course, everybody laughed, and some people thought I was in bad taste. But if you believe in a vision of normalcy, that's normalcy. When T.S. Eliot categorized America as normal, he said it's a country of what? Its monument will be miles of highways and lost golf balls. Now you say Israel has the miles of hallways with an aggressive abnormalcy, as shown in the high accident rate, and of course, no lost golf balls, or very few lost golf balls. And that's, of course, the rejection of normalcy, and that comes to the point. The Jewish experience was such, or the Jewish nature was such, or the Jewish religious quest was such, that there is a kind of birth trauma of ghettoization. Having been in the ghetto and having experienced this so long, we do not go quietly to normalcy. Not a normal religion, not a normalized nationhood, not a normalized ethnic identity. We have to have a specific response which represents universalism overcoming the trauma of ghettoization. Karl Marx, to mention that, is paradigmatic, one of the great paradigms of that trauma of ghettoization response. Indeed, extreme paradigm, because he's saying, we wish to be, not to be a particular normalcy, we wish to be part of a new universalism. Each of the groups I've mentioned, as I'll show in a moment, wants to be part of the universalism. The Marxist thesis was the most extreme. What would it be to be part of the new post-Enlightenment normal universalism? What it would mean the erosion of particularity. You cannot say we'll be a traditional religion and be part of the new universalism, because religion is the enemy of the new emerging universalism. And when Marx wrote one of his early writings against Bruno Bauer on the emancipation of the Jews, specific program, the emancipation of the Jews, he said, all of these emancipations are false. They assume Judaism continues as a kind of liberal bourgeois culture. Jews will be liberal Jews with civil rights as a religious grouping, identified religious grouping in secular bourgeois culture, in capitalist bourgeois culture. This is a mistake. Judaism shouldn't be like this. Judaism should be, like capitalism, should be abolished. Therefore, the religion has to be abolished, the particularist religion. Of course, every religion has to be abolished. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, so on. Judaism in particular, probably because of the trauma of ghettoization, that Marx's, after all, grandfather was the rabbi in the town he was talking about, and his uncle was the rabbi there and later in a town in the Saarland. So, of course, Judaism, above all, is the particularism that stands in the way, religiously. Nations, of course, have to be abolished. The key is the abolition of nationalism. This is false consciousness. Therefore, the new universalism requires people, neither Jew nor Greek, as the gospel says. That is to say, people neither Jew nor Christian, no religion. People of no nationality, neither German nor French nor English nor Italian nor Jewish. The new universal man, who is identified as a sort of fictional hero, the proletariat. It's a term which comes from Roman history, presumably industrial working class later, but in his first use of it prior to even any industrial working class, first use actually in a fictional work of Marx, the proletariat were the Jews. Subsequently, the proletariat, this peculiar Roman class, has no wealth but its children, the proletariat becomes the instrument of historical regeneration, the instrument of universalism. And in every moral case, you show your universalism by allowing the particular entity to which you belong to suffer. You show your loyalty to the universal ideal if you're prepared to sacrifice the particular for the universal. And Marx is certainly to say that the Jewish particularity must be sacrificed for the great universal ideal, just as Rosa Luxemburg says the same thing. The point being, in the trauma of ghettoization, that if in the ghetto model, because of what I said about the universal and particular, to ask the question, is it good for the Jews, is to ask the question, is it good for mankind? Now I have to say, to ask the question, is it good for the Jews or is it good for mankind? The question is, if it's good for the Jews and it's particularist, it has to be good for the mankind. If the two coincide, it's suspect. You know that it's really good for mankind if there's a little price, at any rate, paid by the Jews. Because you know that you're truly universal if you invert the formula of the identity of universalism and particularism. That, of course, is the phenomenon of Marxism in relationship to the Jewish question. But what was at its core was the need to find a new vision of universalism related to particularism. The core was to abolish the Jewish particular for the sake of the new universal. And the new universal was to be a society in which there would be neither Jew nor Christian. There would be a true Jewish emancipation. Neither owner nor worker. Neither, of course, important, but Greek, German, nor Englishman, nor Frenchman, nor Jew. And therefore, the new universalism represented the new formula for changing particular and universal. The proletariat of the chosen people, the vanguard of the proletariat, to which Jews like Marx, or any Jew once he's abolished his particularism, is welcome to join, is the instrument of the new universalism. I think I've kept you long enough on this point to merit a joke, which isn't very funny, like my opening academic joke, but is true, that when Trotsky joined the Social Democratic Party, not the Bolshevik Party, way back when, people asked him, what version of what part of the Social Democratic Party do you wish to join? He was living then in Poland. They said Warsaw, actually, the Polish Social Democratic Party. He said, no, he doesn't want to join the Polish Social Democratic Party. He doesn't feel himself a Pole. They said, oh, Ukrainian Social Democratic Party, since the Bronsteins, his family, came from Ukraine, born near Crimea. He said, no, he doesn't want to join the Ukrainian Socialist Party. Well, the Russian Socialist Party then, it's a majority party, and he was a very well-known figure. No, not the Russian Social Democratic Party. Is it possible you want to join the Bund, the Yiddish Social Democratic Party? Certainly not. He said, well, then we don't understand. He says, I'm a social democrat, a universal social democrat. I joined the Universal Social Democratic Party, at which point they wrote down Jew, because they knew that if he had been a Pole, he would have said Polish Social Democrat. If he'd been Ukrainian, he would have said Ukrainian. If he'd been Russian, he would have said Russian. If he'd been a German, that was one of the options, German Social Democratic Party would have said that. And instead, of course, saying universal meant, that precisely was what they meant by saying, that they did for all people claiming universal social democrats. They knew they were the Jews. Now, in that sense, of course, the vision of universal that erodes particularity is a special kind of particularism, and indeed a Jewish kind of particularism. But I do not mean to imply that the Marxist aberration is not paradigmatic. In some ways it was. If you look at each of the three movements I mentioned, for example, a normal religion like all religions. This meant the reform of traditional orthodoxy. What was the theology of the reform of traditional orthodoxy? The theology of traditional orthodoxy was that Jews were chosen, prophetic Judaism, Jews were a chosen people to be a light to the nations, or legoim netaticha, they made that very standard, to be a light to the nations, and the way we were a light to the nations was by fulfilling social justice. So if Jews fulfilled social justice, not the 613 commands, but the universal commandments of social justice, if they were in the vanguard of human rights movement, if they were in the vanguard of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which of course was founded by Reformed Jewish community, if they were in the vanguard of enlightened social legislation, minimum wages or what have you, or the British Labour Party, you pick it, or the American Socialist Party, or the German Social Democratic Party, if you were or the Liberal Party, if you were in the vanguard of progress, if you're in the vanguard of social justice, if you're in the vanguard of prophetic Judaism interpreted as Reform interpreted prophetic Judaism, helping the poor and the needy, helping tzedakah, doing philanthropy, love of mankind, if you were in the vanguard of this, then of course Jews merited, that was their chosenness, they merited then continuation. If they were not, if they were just normal, if they were playing golf, or if they were in the army doing their thing, if they were treating their neighbors the way most people treat their neighbors, then of course they did not merit survival. They had failed at their chosen function. They were not the chosen people. That aspect, that theology of chosenness through social justice, of vindication through social justice, of Jewish mission as it was called. What is the Jewish mission? To be the vanguard of social justice in the world. That interpretation became standard part of Reform Judaism, the ethical ideal of Reform Judaism in classical reform. And you therefore had that this aspect of universalism is how we identify the universal in particular. Not enough to simply say, this is my tradition and I pursue it. It has its strengths, and I follow the intimations of the strengths of the tradition, but the specific social mission of the Jews to be a vanguard for social progress and social justice. If you take the Zionist model would cease to be normalcy. Struggle occurred very early at different points, the Second Aliyah and so on. Jews are a normal people, therefore normal people do these various activities, they make money on their businesses and so on. It became part of Utopian Zionism, socialist Zionism, hyphenized, symbiotic. Whether it's Golda Meir, Ben Gurion, or what have you, we are socialist Zionists. Socialist Zionists means we're not just Zionist nationalists, because that would be Jabotinsky and the chauvinists, and at the extreme, the fascists. We are not, I'm fascists in quote, we are not socialists per se, because that extreme is the universalist model I referred to, and then we leave Israel and join the Red Brigade, as the Jews of 1920 from Ein Harod did, and so on, and we're part of universal socialism. We are socialist Zionism. We are part of Zionism and normalcy, which at the same time is part of utopian vision, the kibbutz, the histadrut, a model of how the world can be remade, of how a better world can emerge. And that utopian vision is part of the universal particular. Our particular is justified because it's part of universalist vision, in this case utopian socialist vision. And the same is true even for the ethnic nationalist movement, though partly by historical accident, that the Leninist revolution came, and therefore the Jewish ethnic nationalist movement became communist, necessarily communist. And the slogan which emerged is, we will be national in form, that means we speak Yiddish, but socialist in content. And therefore, if there was a Soviet organ which was to tell only the truth, Pravda, when Lunacharsky confiscated the bourgeois press and published and called it Pravda, truth, said from now on we will publish only the truth. And the Yiddish version was emes. Pravda is emes, only spelt in New Yiddish, the secular world, not the old Hebraic religious reactionary way. Yiddish word, a Hebrew word when it appears in Yiddish is spelt as a Hebrew word, aleph mem tov, emes, but spelt the New Yiddish orthography, ayin mem, ayin samach. So this was, of course, to be the new ethnic socialism, which would bring the new vision, whether in Crimea and the collective colonies of Jewish collective colonies in Crimea, or eventually in 1928 and 30s in Birobidzhan. Therefore, the idea that it was inadequate to be normal, Isaiah Berlin has a great quip, it's not normal to want to be normal, it's inadequate to be normal. Normalcy had to have this special utopian messianism, either in the pure universalist form of Marxism, or in the special amalgam, socialist Zionism, classical religious reform with the Jewish mission towards social justice, ethnic Judaism, which was nationalist in form but socialist in content, became the operative ideological visions. Now I come to my second to last point, fifth point, the breakdown of that vision. Where the breakdown occurred in every case is different. Every case is connected with the trauma of the 20th century, different, but real. What was the breakdown of the last one? I'll do it in reverse order. What was the breakdown of ethnic Yiddishist, socialist Judaism, diaspora, nationalist, ethnic, Yiddish, socialist. Suppose you'd say Stalin, beginning with 1928, 29 already, the great purge of the Jews who were Yiddish socialists and so on. You might say it came later. You might say it came in the 30s. You still could believe in Shalom Aleichem and parrots and the Yiddish theater and so on through the mid-30s. But by then it was dying. Stalin was killing it. You might say it didn't come till much later. In the current issue of Soviet Jewish Affairs, there is the report on the rehabilitation under the Gorbachev regime, under the Gorbachev government, report of the rehabilitation of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, Pfeffer, Michels, those people, including one named who I did not know before, named Losanovsky. And Losanovsky was an early friend of Lenin. And he says to the court his confidence in socialism is such that he knows the injustice of this trial. That's August 1952, when 16 Yiddish writers were killed in one day and so on. The injustice of this trial will be unearthed by socialism in the future. When that happens, he wishes above all as his first request, as his dying request, to be readmitted to the Soviet Communist Party. And you see, the faith is there even in adversity, even in 52. But the point is that that faith is now dead. No one now believes in it in the Soviet Jewish community. Indeed, so much so, I don't think they believe in the possibility of Gorbachev making a civil transition, which is part of the emigration movement. But whether that's the case or not, the pattern, the old pattern of saying there will be an ethnic nationalist Judaism which will be socialist in content but nationalist in form, whose classics will be the Yiddish theater, the Moscow Art Theater, and so on, in Yiddish and so on, that has vanished and died. And it probably died as early as 28. Certainly it died by 52. Perhaps 52 was the final death knell. After the war, there was some attempt to say we would restore Crimea, a Jewish Yiddish-speaking territorial base. The second one, let me take it this order. The reform Jewish one, in its classic form, died when Hitler came to power in Germany. Up to then, the belief that Judaism should be de-ethnicized, denationalized, should be an ethical monotheistic religion with a special mission of social justice. And when Hitler came to power, the segregation of the Jewish community of Germany, Israel is the one place, Palestine then is the one place which offered a welcome refuge if you could get certificates from the British, then the recognition of what Milton Himmelfarb once called the Armenian principle, that only Armenians in the last analysis give a damn about Armenians, that only Cambodians give a damn about Cambodians, that the world universal world would not look after the Jews under Hitler. This took root. You could say there were other factors. You could say Rabbi Joseph suggested that he knows the injustice of this trial. That's August 1952, when 16 Yiddish writers were killed in one day and so on. The injustice of this trial will be unearthed by socialism in the future. When that happens, he wishes above all as his first request, as his dying request, to be readmitted to the Soviet Communist Party. And you see, the faith is there even in adversity, even in 52. But the point is that that faith is now dead. No one now believes in it in the Soviet Jewish community. Indeed, so much so, I don't think they believe in the possibility of Gorbachev making a civil transition, which is part of the emigration movement. But whether that's the case or not, the pattern, the old pattern of saying there will be an ethnic nationalist Judaism which will be socialist in content but nationalist in form, whose classics will be the Yiddish theater, the Moscow Art Theater, and so on, in Yiddish and so on, that has vanished and died. And it probably died as early as 28. Certainly it died by 52. Perhaps 52 was the final death knell. After the war, there was some attempt to say we would restore Crimea, a Jewish Yiddish-speaking territorial base. The second one, let me take it this order. The reform Jewish one, in its classic form, died when Hitler came to power in Germany. Up to then, the belief that Judaism should be de-ethnicized, denationalized, should be an ethical monotheistic religion with a special mission of social justice. And when Hitler came to power, the segregation of the Jewish community of Germany, Israel is the one place, Palestine then is the one place which offered a welcome refuge if you could get certificates from the British, then the recognition of what Milton Himmelfarb once called the Armenian principle, that only Armenians in the last analysis give a damn about Armenians, that only Cambodians give a damn about Cambodians, that the world would not, universal world would not look after the Jews under Hitler. This took root. You could say there were other factors. You could say Rabbi Joseph suggested general disillusion with the ideal of progress. You could also argue a simpler, more mundane answer. The classical German Jewish Reform congregations were infiltrated by upwardly mobile ethnic Jews from Eastern Europe, and therefore ethnicity replaced classical religious reform. You could argue, of course, which is very important, the rise of the State of Israel in 48, the fight for Israel in 48 is the renationalization of reform. But one way or another, the idea of reform as a liberal universalist religion which would de-ethnicize and denationalize Judaism as part of the formula between universalism and particularism happened. And we are living through, and this is speculative and provocative, I hope, we're living through the sort of painful withdrawal of socialist-Zionism. One reason why you get such anti-Zionist, anti-Israel criticism in one spectrum of the Israeli politic is because they are disappointed, and disappointed because socialist Zionism has not worked out. The Thatcherite movement, the Reaganite movement, privatized Israel chemical industries through Credit Suisse First Boston, telling you how you'd sell shares in it. The kibbutz movement being bankrupt, and you have to then say, now we refloat it, and we float it through traditional capitalist ways of looking for profit and profitability in kibbutz industries. Kur, the jewel of the Histadrut, the jewel of the trade union movement, the only corporation that Israel has in the Fortune 500, going bankrupt, and bid coming to it from American Jewish family. Give us we'll write off the losses if you give us the company for whatever it is, $725 million. The point is that means socialist Zionism as a symbiotic movement has no future. And since it's a historicist movement, its truth is that it carries the future. Its failure is devastating. You say, but this is the devastation of socialism, not the devastation of Zionism. This is happening in Poland and in Lithuania and Czechoslovakia. So what's the difference? Yes, but if it happens in Israel, that means the dream, especially of secular socialist Zionism, is lost. Then Zionism has to make it on the claim of normalcy, and that's a difficult thing. That's a difficult thing. So all three have this trouble. And of course, the trouble reflects, and this too is the speculative and provocative point, I think the trouble reflects itself in American Jewish liberalism. Because although I've given the ideological forms in their classic form, mission, doctrine, reform theology, and Marxism, and socialist Zionism, and ethnic Soviet nationalism, Jewish ethnic Soviet nationalism, the Evseksia, the Yiddish section of the Jewish Communist Party, the Jewish section of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, though I've done that in its classic ideological formulation, the heart blood for the individual Jewish person was liberalism. The post-traditionalist religion, the religion in which universalism and particularism were united, when I spoke about the covenant of Abraham, the breakdown of that covenant, the traditional religion for the Jew was liberalism. Liberalism didn't mean quite the ideological formulations I've given it, but it meant something about you satisfy the universal by being partly a Jewish particularist, but above all a liberal Jewish particularist. There's an old Viennese liberal joke, which, like Viennese Jewish humor, always has a bite in it that's a little bit internal, self-critical. Tell you a couple others in the question period perhaps, but this one gets the point. One person, Viennese Jew to another, what happens to all those years we were in yeshiva and cheder together and studied Jewish classics and so on? What remains for you now that, Viennese Jewry came from little towns, Freud came from Buchach and so on, little towns in Galicia and went to Vienna. What happens from all those years in cheder here in liberal Vienna and cosmopolitan Vienna? And the fellow says, well, I still read the Wiener Neue Freie Presse, which is like saying I still believe in the New York Times. I'm still liberal. Yeah. And the other fellow says, well, I'm still afraid of dogs. But the point is that something remains, and what remained was this ethos, that from the French Revolution, which emancipated the Jews, if you choose liberty and order, Jews are on the side of civil liberty. Don't worry about civil order, no laws against vagrancy, disturbance of the peace. The problem is civil liberty. If you choose equality and hierarchy, Jews are on the side of equality, not on the side of hierarchy. Discrimination for relevant reasons, which is hierarchy. Therefore, equality. Now, the egalitarian ethos, the libertarian ethos, if you choose fraternity and otherness, Jews are on the side of fraternity. All men are brethren, not Jews are different and need their special needs. Other groups need their special needs. Liberty, equality, fraternity remains the functional religion. Yet liberty, equality, and fraternity and equality, if they are primary, if they're not critical, if they're not liberty against the old order, equality against the old hierarchy, fraternity against the exclusive otherness, if they are primary and you have no order and no hierarchy and no otherness, then you have a formula for self-destruction. A city like New York, which would have liberty without order, which would have equality without a hierarchy of people who can earn more money and bring more business and so on, which should have fraternity without a sense of distinctive otherness of different ethnic communities. A city like that, that's a formula for self-destructiveness. The secondary value is becoming primary. And in that sense, the crisis of liberalism, the crisis of political liberalism, the Jews become with the blacks, with whom they share very little in socioeconomic status, of course, the only groups that are loyal to the democratic liberal vision of the 30s, while the rest of the country moves in different ways. There's an interesting political problem that has to do with exactly what we're talking about, namely the vision of the Jewish community on universal and particular. That brings me to my conclusion. My conclusion is that what I'm saying was first to tell you that what I'm saying is true. That is to say, that there was a tradition of making the universal and particular one as my two eyes make one in sight. That it failed and was replaced by a restless search. It failed except in the separatist Orthodox in Williamsburg and the Ger Rebbe and so on. Replaced by a restless search for a new formulation which would combine the need for the Jews to feel that they are making a universalist contribution, which is a kind of religious need, and the particularist ethos of Jewish survival. And the various combinations have had elements of success. Folk Yiddish culture, certainly an element of success. Peretz, Shalom Aleichem. Zionism, certainly an element of success. Reformed Judaism, certainly an element of success. And elements of tragic unease, tragic inability to control and chart the future. My comment is just modest. I do not believe in Messianism. Even the Messianic view, as Litvaks don't believe in Messianism. Southern Polish Jews do believe in Messianism. That's why they eat the soup before the meat, as you know, because of they eat meat before they eat the meat before the soup, because the Messiah will come, they will finish the main course. And the point is that messianic belief of that community, the community from which Marx from Lvov and Freud from Buchach and so on, and these kind of messianic visions come, that kind of folk community, which even in them, even in their heartland, it used to be said, pray every day for the coming of the Messiah and thank God daily that he doesn't come in your time. Now the point is that, in Yiddish perhaps it sounds better, but the idea is the same. Say psalms every day for the coming of the Messiah and give thanks to God every day that he doesn't come in your time. The point, my suspicion of messianism, my suspicion of the search for transcendence, simply means that my formulation would be that somewhere Jews as a particularist people with particularist traditions have, without looking, without searching for utopian goals, have built into those particularist traditions a lot of universal values. That's what I meant when I said something like Shakespeare is a universalist and a particularist. And every culture has in its particularism a lot of universal values. What you do is locate yourself within that tradition. Jews, of course, in the American particularist values, American Jews and the Jewish particularist values, Israeli Jews within the Israeli cultural tradition, which is now a century old, and Jewish religious values, and seek to define as best you will, since there is no covenantal guarantee here, the intimations, the direction, the possibilities of that tradition. With no messianic vision, no special mission, you simply are, in a very matter-of-fact way, arguing for a possibility of achieving universal values through building on the particularities of your tradition in your place and in your time. This is, of course, to say that Jews will be emancipated from their post-religious need of universalism and from the trauma of ghettoization, which makes them so hyper on their universalism. This is a very tall order indeed. It would mean, for example, that the Anthony Lewises of the world would no longer wish to insist that Israel survive by an internal double standard which is stronger than any nation could ever ask of itself and survive. These are consummations that perhaps are as messianic and wishful and utopian as those I've condemned. Nonetheless, that's the direction I would go.
Thank you so much. In a certain way, it would seem then that the Judaism that we need to account for the survival of, or the Jewish people whose existence we need to account for the survival of, really originated not more than about 200 years ago, in the sense that, if I understood you, that up until the eclipse of medieval times for the Jews and the dawning of emancipation, the solidity of Jewish life and so forth is comprehensible within the framework of that special blend of the universal and particular. Could you amplify that a little more? In other words, what were Jews doing in their daily lives? And is it fair to say that they had a sense that they were really God's agents for redeeming the world? Would a medieval Jew have thought in those terms, do you think?
Well, two parts. First, I would not maintain, of course, that's the reason for their survival. Part of my point was simply that's the internal morale. They might not have survived. The number of Jews that survived after 1648 with Khmelnytsky massacres and so on was relatively small and could have turned the other way, could have gone the other way. There's no, in my view, the formula, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, the eternity of Israel will not be denied, is not a guarantee. And the same is true after 1492, by the way. There are very iffy moments. I don't mean to say that if you have a formula which guarantees universality and particularity, you've got it made in point of view of survival. That would be what is called a rationalist fallacy, that what ought to be, or what maybe ought to be, is in fact the case. My whole point was the Ecclesiastes quote, "The race is not to the swift, nor wisdom to men of understanding." But as to the degree of self-consciousness, it was internalized, but I think the answer is yes. If you look at how traditional prayer is said, Yemenite Jews, Sephardic Jews from Turkey, Lithuanian Jews, Galicianer Jews, French Jews, notice how they sing out loud, especially the points that are embarrassing to you. Something like, for example, they make the Kiddush and they sing out loud, Ki banu b'charto, for us thou hast chosen, sanctified from all nations. Especially you have guests at your Seder table, so on, you're a little embarrassed. They weren't embarrassed, they emphasized that. Now, what did they mean by that? If you go to the bar mitzvah, they call up to the Torah, the aliyah, and that's what they knew. You know, weren't Zionists. People say aliyah. They didn't know aliyah means going to Israel. That was remote for them. That's part of the messianic vision. And aliyah meant being called up to the Torah. What did they say? Ki bono b'charto, us thou hast chosen. Did they not know that chosen meant chosen because God had chosen you as the agents of His plan that you should, if you obeyed the commandments, that you would survive, that the eternity of Israel will not be redeemed. And in that sense, you were guaranteeing the survival of mankind. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think they stress so much the universalism, the guaranteeing of survival of mankind. They stressed the particularism, but the universalism was built into it. In other words, they had no conflict or guilt about, well, why should we survive if other people suffer? Of course we have to survive. We are the chosen people. Mm-hmm. Now, that, I think, was... I don't mean to imply that there was an ideological self-consciousness in the sense that they worked out the theory, but all the text, all the prayers that are the emphasis on the prayers and so on, I think shows quite clearly that this was understood.
So now then, is this a particular, what shall we say, spiritualization of a kind of will to live in this community that is without without equivalence anywhere else. I guess the thing, again, going back to the Buber citation I gave at the beginning, is there really such a thing as a unique phenomenon in history? Aren't most things replicable? Haven't we seen equivalents, parallels elsewhere, whatever it happens to be? Last session we examined the rise and fall of great empires and so on and so forth, and saw a succession of waves and patterns and so forth, and certainly Ecclesiastes would buy into that whole idea. And yet here is the Jewish people plying its way through history, seemingly without any parallel in the cultural experience of any other nation. Would you buy that much of an overstatement?
I would say, of course, going to your first part, that the special character here, which as Matthew Arnold pointed out, of Judaism as religion breathing household laws, that's an interesting point, and goes to all sorts of interesting characterizations. The first question. No, I'm afraid I have to be agnostic on the second.
That's all right. We're going to have a theologian in 2 weeks.
Philosophically and temperamentally. Mm-hmm. Philosophically, which doesn't matter, the term unique is a very difficult term. In a certain sense, everybody's experience is unique. The English, the British, the Scotch experience is unique. Cologne and so on. English experience is unique. People that amalgamated the Britons under Roman, the Scotch, the only people who weren't conquered under the Roman Empire, where the Jews were, Jutes and Picts and Angles and Saxons, and mixing them together and producing this great literature and great culture, then a great Elizabethan empire, and then a great 18th century Enlightenment, great world empire, which after all created the state of Israel, despite its own will at the end. And then, of course, the ability to transform, to stand up against Hitler and uniquely win the war against Nazi barbarism with Winston Churchill, and then transform itself into a new role, to a leader of socialism, then a leader in the reversal of socialism. Remarkable history. Replicable? How? Only if you generalize. Mm-hmm. Jewish history? Incredible history. Unique, certainly. Replicable? Only if you generalize. You make, people say King David and Goliath, you make the Philistines and the Israelites and so on. No, it's unique, and it has this fact. It is, it is a factual truth that it's around with record of continuity from the 21st century or the 19th century to the present, and has had this remarkable, extraordinary cataclysm, extraordinary revival at various times. I could go into that, but I think that any theory which would say yes and no one else is like it is vulnerable to the charge, yes, but so would the Scotch say, but no one else is like it, and so would the Greek Orthodox say, and no one else is like it, and so on.
I guess then maybe perhaps what I'm thinking, what you're saying is very cogent and probably deflating to some of the people here who like to play locate the Luntsman and go with C.P. Snow's idea of Jewish genetic superiority and so on. But then, coming back to it, are the challenges that Jews have had to face, given the disabilities under which Jews have lived? First of all, that just for 18 of those centuries they lacked a homeland, they lacked the stability and presumably the survival element that having a land of one's own and some semblance of a nation state represents some kind of organic, biological security for a people. And yet here we were dispersed all over the world and so on. Is it then a creative response to adversity? Have the Jews acquired a greater knack for that than most other people? Would you say that could be part of the process?
Well, perhaps. There are two metaphors that are very fond of, and they're very funny because they're very Jewish, one of ice and one of fire. Robert Frost has this poem. Some say the world will end with fire and some with ice. I think ice is nice and so on. Ice in the Jewish metaphor isn't so nice. The metaphor of ice, which was Sir Louis Bernstein Namier's great historical metaphor about Jewish emancipation, about what happened in the 18th century, is not a very attractive one, you see. Now, he viewed it as follows. There was a Jewish history had, after its period of normalcy, which you referred to in Israel and so on, that's why he was a Zionist, even though he was in some ways Zionist and anti-Semite, the Jewish history had congealed into a kind of frozen ice. And that was how he viewed traditionalist orthodoxy. He came from a very great yichus on both his mother's father's side. He was Namirovsky originally, became Sir or Lord Namir. The point is, Regius Professor at Oxford in modern history and advisor to the Foreign Office and so on. The point is that as if I can use this clenched fist, as a frozen iceberg, it had survived. And then the sun of freedom and emancipation came, and the outer parts melt. And then as you go more and more into freedom, more and more of the outer parts melt. And what survives is the hard core. On that image, who would survive in American Judaism is, of course, Lubavitcher Rebbe and the Sotner Rebbe and the Bover Rebbe and the Hasidim and so on. The hardcore vanishes. Indeed, the 19th century Jewish community, reform part of Jewish community with self-consciousness, with the vanguard community I mentioned, said, but then we will survive influencing history as a current influences the ocean. We will have melted, but our influence will be there in the ethical life of the nation among which we live. Now that's one metaphor, and a very pessimistic metaphor, but it counts for survival in terms of the hard iceberg core of traditionalist Judaism. The other metaphor is the fire one, which is of course volcanic. You know, you have these damp fires, and Judaism seems extinguished for various periods, and then suddenly out of nowhere, boom, there's an eruption. So 17th century, I mentioned 1648, Khmelnytsky pogroms and so on. And the numbers are very, very small. Jewish community in the later part of the 17th century, it's very difficult to know how close to demographic extinction the community was. And you have this tremendous explosion of fertility. You have the birth of Hasidism in the later part of the 18th and early part of the 19th century. Tremendous explosion of Jewish demographic growth, of Jewish creativity in Hasidism. And you have 19th century assimilation, Central Europe, Herzl and so on. You think, well, the fires are damp. Boom, suddenly you get Zionists. You don't know where they come from. They're coming in waves to Israel. And that, of course, has no chance at all. It's, Lamdan's poem, we came as little pioneers, we danced the horror, we close our eyes because we were dancing on an abyss. And suddenly, through the years, the abyss fills up. If Soviet Jewry really comes, the abyss will almost be filled. You will have the basis for a normal nation that has a demographic base to defend itself, demographic, technological base to defend itself. So the notion that throughout Jewish history you have sort of dormant fires, dormant, extinct, almost extinct volcano, and then every once in a while suddenly this deep eruption. The eruption Spanish Jewry in the 12th century, the eruption of great creative power in Babylonian Jewry in the 4th and 5th century, the eruption of great creative power in Sephardic Jewry in the 17th century, the eruption, let's say, of Hasidism in the 18th century, of Zionism in the end of 19th and 20th. So you have the exact counter-metaphor. Now, my point on all this is simply, this is a fact. I never quarrel with facts, but no one can give an explanation which satisfies some of the criteria you were wanting, a unique, predictable explanation about the Jewish future. If you could, you would argue that the future is guaranteed, covenantal guarantee. I don't believe the future is guaranteed on anything.
Well, I'm sure many of you have questions, and I won't take all of this on my own. A gentleman in the back with his hand up.
Because they destroy education, because they're not there to make solid citizens.
Well, I think you've raised the right kind of mood question against what I was saying. Yeah. I think the quote with which he began, I'm not sure the exact source of it. It's worth looking. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Abraham Lincoln quotes it somewhere. I'm not sure which text it's from, Mein Chazon or something. Is it from Ezekiel? I'm not sure. Where there is no vision, the people perish. He's saying, what I was suggesting at the end, or he wasn't criticizing me, criticizing other things, but nonetheless, I accept the criticism. What I was suggesting at the end was sort of, let's be pragmatic, let's be balanced, let's move forward to solve our problems. He was suggesting, what about vision? Where there is no vision, the people perish. And if you say, well, we have technique, he was saying, well, the engineering schools, the business schools, they have technique, we need vision. Yes, I have to concede that. I don't have an answer for you. My concern was the other direction, and that is to say, the prophets say you need vision. The whole point is they're false prophets. They're visionaries. They're people who have visions that are wrong, that are misleading, that are illusions or delusions. My point is, of course, that we have lived through an intense period of false visions, of wrong visions. If you look at the prophecy, you say you need prophets. I'd say yes, but how do you avoid Nevi'e Sheker? How do you avoid false prophets? It was in a city like Prague, a beautiful city. You'd say, how could this city be in this situation? Where the cab drivers say, the dollar was worth a crown. Now it's whatever it is, 40 to a crown. How did this happen? You say, it happened because they pursued a false vision. So it's true, that's the dilemma. Where there is no vision, the people perish. But it's also true that we have had an enormous number of people perish because of false visions. Martin Heidegger was a philosopher, said, the German people have an I-thou, that's Buber's phrase, an I-thou experience with Hitler. This is the vision. Well, it's a terrible vision. Pol Pot had a vision of a new man. Wouldn't be in the city of Phnom Penh. They would be out in the fields. Well, that's the killing fields. So you have to worry about false visions, utopian visions, visions that do great harm. And my concern, it's true, was much more not about the absence of vision, but about the excess of vision. Now, I suppose you need balance in this. My point, I did try to answer you on the Democratic Party and so on specifically when I said liberalism began with liberty against order. You had excessive order. You had excessive, James Joyce's Ulysses couldn't be published. Therefore, you need liberty against order. Wonderful. You need a balance between liberty and order. Is the balance to be struck by saying you can have sadomasochistic photographs funded by the government? Child pornography funded by the government? If you've seen the Mapplethorpe paintings, photographs, pardon me, that's what we're talking about. Indeed, if the photographs are real, if you actually took the pictures, then the deeds which were done, which are being photographed, are violations of the abuse of children. So you do have an interesting question. You say, well, how do we draw the line between liberty and order? You say, well, we don't consider civic order at all. We only consider civil liberty. Well, then I think you don't have balance. Now, I don't say I have a substitute for vision, but I do have a vision, if I may call it that, of balance. Say you have equality, it's a wonderful ideal. You need hierarchy. You need to say that people who work better, people who achieve excellence, will do better things. The college won't simply admit people who can't do work as well as people who can do work very well. If you say, no, we want an egalitarian college with equal access of all people, then you don't have a balance between equality and hierarchy, equality and excellence. Well, then I have a vision of balance. Now, it's true that doesn't give me primary vision, liberty and order, equality and hierarchy, and so on. I think as a society, we're failing on that balance. It may be that vision would help us. I think we've had surfeit of vision in the 20th century. That's where I'm coming from. What we need, that's what I meant about saying, I don't want Peres, Rabin, Sharon, and Ahrens to have visions. I want them to play golf a little bit, to relax, to see their problems.
One of the problems, of course, in Israel is there's so much vision. If you got all the leaders of all the political parties, it would be, about 10 foursomes, I guess, right? That's
no, you won't get Rabbi Shach.
No, that's true.
To play
That's
golf.
true. Right. Yes, the lady in the second row. The question had to do with explicating further the terms normalcy and universalism and whether any of these kinds of things exist in some kind of reality or can be pointed to.
Well, I sort of agreed again with the critical emphasis in the question when I mentioned that quip that it isn't normal to want to be normal. But yes,
that was Isaiah Berlin who.
But and he said it specifically about the Israeli Zionism. He said, and therefore is all of Jewish history and all this tragedy that you had referred to and the uniqueness and so on, which you said is rhetorically so attractive and even humanly so attractive. The sufferings and we could go on a variety of things: the Inquisition, the heroism, the sanctification of the name, and the martyrdom, and the Maccabees, and all that, to end in a vision of a normal little country like some little Albania. And the point is, Albania isn't quite a normal country, but get another one. And the answer, of course, is that a term is always significant relative to its opposite. Great philosopher Austin says, which term wears the trousers? So, any term. You take real. I say to you, what does real mean? That's real. And you say, well, you mean real as opposed to counterfeit? Do you mean real as opposed to fake? Do you mean real as opposed to reproduction? Do you mean real as opposed to illusion? So now normalcy, what does it mean? Well, normal as opposed to abnormal. Now certainly the Zionists thought it is abnormal for the Jews to be in a position where other nations can beat up on them and they can't have one place to go to. And therefore they wanted normalcy. They wanted a place for them to go to. If there is a trouble for the Americans in Grenada, you may say it's false. I don't mean to get into a political issue, but if there were trouble, if there had been trouble for students, American medical students in Grenada, they can be flown home to the United States. If there is trouble for Jews in the Soviet Union, they should be flown to Israel. If there's trouble for Jews in Egypt, as there was in '67, well, they were flown to Spain, but they should be flown to Israel. That's what normalcy would mean for them, normalcy as opposed to abnormalcy. And there was an abnormal condition, and that's what they meant by normalcy. It is true that it also had a philosophical elaboration. Jews had been the objects of history. They should be the subjects of history. But very concretely, I understand the abnormalcy of not having a place of refuge which you can go to as of right, and the normalcy of correcting that. It's not the only normalcy. Now, they felt the Jews were abnormal in the sense that they didn't have vocational choices that weren't skewed. There you might have more difficulty. They had a vision normalcy would mean that they would have a whole range of vocations rather than an abnormal set of vocations. But that's what they meant. And given that they thought it was abnormal for Jews to all be small shopkeepers as the Zionists envisioned them in Eastern Europe, it would be normal if they also were farmers and also were entrepreneurs and also were military and also were police and so on. And I can understand, and I think you can understand what that means. So relative to what you mean by abnormalcy becomes your conception of normalcy. And if you feel the abnormalcy is acute, you do. The same thing is true for universalism. Relative to what you mean by particularism, the balance between particularism becomes your concept of universalism. Now, in the joke that I told, you said, what does it mean to be universal? And the standard joke was, it means that I do not claim to be what? What does it mean to be universal linguist? You say, well, I'm a universalist in language. You say, I don't understand what you mean. Do you speak English? No. Do you speak French? No. What do you do? I speak symbolic logic. You say, yes, that's the universal language of all mankind, until such time as people will pick a particular language. Sometimes Oppenheimer, a very interesting phenomenon, who became communist of this, but wanted to be a universalist person, and that sort of ideal. He wants to speak the language of physics, and he went into Buddhism for the same reason, but not the language of the particularist culture. So the hunger for universalism was a desire to erode certain aspects of particularism. Now, I think that conception makes sense. That is to say, I think it makes sense to say a person who says, what? I'm interested, let me draw the illustration more complexly without taking too much time. A person who would say, I'm interested in my particular family, my particular country, my particular interests, and I'm not concerned with the world, would be a person who's very strongly particularist. At the extreme, for example, just to give a moral caricature, if you remember the chauffeur during the Kefauver hearings, that's before your time, but there was a man, Mr. Valachi, was the chauffeur during the Kefauver hearings. And he said, my morality was he didn't use the word particularist, but my morality was a particularist morality. I wasn't concerned with what the mafia were doing to other people. I was concerned with doing an honest day's work. I drove the car, honest day's work for a day's pay, with bringing the pay home to my wife and children, unlike the other people who used to fool around, and with being a loyal husband, a loyal father. That's a certain kind of particularist ethos. And if you extend it, what are your particular values, your family or your house or your people or your street, you get particularism. If you say that's not enough, you have to, the old joke against Trotsky, a different one. The Trotskys make revolutions, so the Bronsteins of the world, that's his family name, was Bronstein, so and his family lost its 500 acres in the Ukraine, so the Bronsteins of the world will suffer. And that's the point. We are concerned with universal. We are concerning the state, the condition of mankind, and we don't worry about the fact that the particular Bronsteins suffer. We know all sorts of people who are universalists in that sense, who are concerned with changing the state or condition of the world and not concerned with the particular good of their neighbor or their family or what have you. And in that sense, there's a tension between particularism and universalism. The two models I just now stated, Valachi, who minds the store and looks after his family but drives the car for the mafia, is a particularist who's lost any conception of moral universality. The opposite, the illustration of Trotsky, is a moral universalist who's lost his sense of reality about the particular needs of the people he's involved in. And I think those are caricatures, but the caricatures, well, they're not caricatures, they're historically true. I think they're extreme positions, but the extreme positions would show the paradigmatic use of these terms. In other words, if I were not giving a popular lecture, a public lecture on this issue, but if I were giving philosophical analysis of the terms, they would stand up along the lines I've suggested.
Okay. Yes, Jack Conahee.
Just a very tiny point, the allusion to the Cincinnati art dispute.
Yes.
Unlike the NEH dispute, the earlier one,
Yes.
I do not think federal funding is an issue in that dispute.
Yes.
Municipal, you see. Just a very small. But the
I was not referring to Cincinnati. As a matter of fact, I spoke on Maplethorpe to the International Society of Photographers when the issue was funding, and that's the issue I was referring to.
Yes, lady in the back row.
But no, Jack, your point is well taken. On Cincinnati, there is no federal funding.
I wondered, you were talking about the breakdown of universalism and particularists, and I was wondering whether you would see the state of American Jewry and worldwide Jewry in those terms, in the sense that you have growing assimilation, which in a sense is universalism, and you have growing return to fundamentalism or traditionalism, which is particularism in a form. And in a sense, you've got this real divergence, and the liberalism that you espouse is in fact sinking and going nowhere.
That's right. I think that's a very true observation. I would agree with it. American Jewish community is faced with extreme polarization, where the sort of balance between universalism and particularism, which Jews were comfortable with, which is sort of liberal wing of the Democratic Party, early wing of, early type of democratic socialism, Eugene Debs and so on, where there was a certain comfort, tension between the two, but a certain playoff of the Jews were comfortable between the universalist aspects of their liberal ethos and the particularist aspects. That was in balance. And then it was believed that the two fringes would vanish, the fringe being on the one hand the more radical universalist element, either, pardon me, I should strike you, as your point is correct, the more radical universalist element, either the more radical universalist element meaning politically, ideologically, or the more conservative universalist element, by which I mean the type of reform with a mission, classical reform, old-time Temple Emmanuel, and so on, where there was, or which tended, they believed, on a fourth-generation phenomena, that is, first-generation extreme Orthodox, second-generation traditional, third-generation conservative reform, fourth-generation non-Jewish. And you had that family model. Mendelssohn is a very good case. Moses, son of Mendel, Moses Mendelssohn, Felix M. Bartholdy, the Emperor Mendelssohn, and then the other Mendelssohns, who later kept the name Mendelssohn, but by the time that when Hitler made the deal with the Mendelssohn Bank in 1935, I think, there wasn't a single Mendelssohn who was Jewish. The point is, even though they still have the collection of famous Juden porcelain, the porcelain that Jews had to buy because there were so many seconds when Prussia was trying to develop Dresden porcelain, the Jews had to buy it in order to get married. They still kept the porcelain that Moses Mendelssohn had to buy, the 18 monkeys he had to buy, seconds of porcelain that he had to buy when he married, I think her name was Frida Bamberger. But at any rate, the point after is there were no Jewish Mendelssohns. Now, in that sense, your point is very correct. Universalist cultural assimilationism on the one hand, either conservative or radical, and polarization, growing polarization, because for the first time the separatist Orthodox Jewish community around the world, in Israel, the United States, and so on, simply does not accept the model of the breakdown of the ghetto. They simply choose self-segregation and make it work. American Jewish culture was to be a culture of the public school and Hebrew school afterward, or the public school and the congregational school, and they have made the traditional yeshiva. So you're absolutely right. There is more Yiddish learnt in schools in America today than in the heyday of radical Jewish socialism. The Yiddish that is learnt is the Talmud translated into Yiddish in the Orthodox day schools. So the point about polarization of the community is true. And then the interesting question, which is Yeats's question in the poem in 1939, the center cannot hold, whether the center can hold is, of course, the dramatic question for the future of American Jewry. And that's, in some sense, that's the external, demographic, human, social motif of what I was describing, the internal morale motif of the connection between particularism and universalism.
Well, I would like to thank Professor Sidorsky for this week's deeply thoughtful presentation. And I would like to invite all of you to be back with us next week when we will cover an ethnological, sociological perspective with Professor John Murray Cudahy from Hunter College. And the following week after that will be Professor Michael Wishograd of Baruch College dealing with a non-agnostic view, a contemporary theological interpretation. Speaking of theological and sociological, we do have a program this coming Sunday night, April 22nd. I know you all know that it's Earth Day, but it is also Yom HaShoah. And we will have a program here at the Y at 7:30 in the evening. I'll be conducting a brief service of memorial, and following that we'll have remarks by Michael Berenbaum, who is director of the National Holocaust Museum program in Washington, and quite a fine theologian, and Anne Royfey, whose book, A Season of Healing, created quite a stir this year. So I hope to see you over the next week or so. Good night, all.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.